Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Health and Wellness Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. Today, I want to talk to you guys about the differences between introversion and extroversion, as well as a little bit about ambiverts. I think that during this time of practicing social distancing in particular, it can be a little bit more difficult for some of our extrovert counterparts if they're having to be penned up all the time right now. It's important to understand that social distancing means mostly physical proximity. It doesn't mean emotional distancing or actual aspects of being social in ways that don't involve being right with someone. We can still be reaching out to our extrovert friends in particular and making sure that they're okay via FaceTime and other forms of social media. So to really understand this, we're going to talk about the differences between the two, because I think that introversion and extroversion are very often misunderstood. People tend to conflate them with misanthropy. So they think that it's about people liking others rather than really where their energy is coming from. So we're going to dive straight in, and today we're also going to talk about health differences between the two groups, including mental health differences, as well as different aspects of well-being that are unique to the two groups. So let's just dive straight in. For introversion and extroversion, extroversion plays a big role in how a person tends to direct their energy. So, are we directing it externally or internally? And the amount of it can help us understand how different people are likely to respond to or experience different stimuli, such as being cooped up at the house right now. For introverts, being in social distancing mode is something we get to do, whereas for a lot of extroverts, it's something they have to do. I also liken that in a professional context to those of us who have had to be managers before and give performance reviews. Giving performance reviews to your employees is something that extroverts get to do, whereas it's something that introverts have to do. I hope that contextualizes it a bit for you. And both introverts and extroverts have their own advantages and disadvantages, but it is truly a spectrum. So it's not an either-or dichotomy here. They're not just binary opposites and that's it. Remember, we also have binary mediators, which are terms like ambivert, which is somewhere in the middle of those. So you can exist anywhere on this spectrum of introversion and extroversion. But by understanding where we are, we can also address areas in which we perhaps tend to have more trouble and identify areas we can work on. So understanding how introverted or extroverted we are can also help people understand us. It helps us understand ourselves and understand others, and also to be understood when everyone has a proper understanding of the terminology. So we're going to start with what is an introvert versus an extrovert versus an ambivert. In the early 1900s, the psychologist Carl Jung proposed that there were core ideas in the personality, like the constructs of introversion and extroversion. He also suggested that the main distinction between the personalities is the source and the direction or expression of a person's energy. And he defined extroversion as an outward turning of that energy, and introversion as an inward turning of it. So for introverts, we tend to think, feel, and act in ways that really suggest that the subject is our prime motivating factor. Extroverts direct their interest towards their surrounding environment. They think, feel, and act in relation to external factors rather than to internal ones. So if you think about a really busy social event, extroverts are stereotyped to really revel in those interactions, and they tend to love it, whereas introverts feel their energies kind of drained from it, and we need a little bit of time alone to compensate for that energy that has really been drained from us. So the primary difference is that extroverts derive energy from these social interactions, whereas introverts have to expend energy from it. So extroverts lose energy being alone and get more of it by being in groups or hanging out with people, whereas introverts get drained from hanging out with people and get their energy from their alone time. Jung also thought that there is a third category that is far-reaching and admitted that it's hard to determine whether that group's energy comes from within or without. That group is called the Ambiverts. It appears that ambiverts draw from both being out in public and being alone in varying degrees along the introvert-extrovert spectrum. Another psychologist from the 1920s, Heidbreder, suggested that, quote, pronounced introversion and pronounced extroversion merely represent extremes of behavior connected by continuous gradations. In other words, the evidence points to a single mixed type rather than to two sharply separated classes, unquote. So Heidbreder was really just saying that it is on a spectrum, like we discussed earlier, and that is what he's referring to with the gradations, and that some folks experience more of it than the other, more of one side than the other, and some folks are really in the middle. Conklin also thought that the existence of ambiverts was the most normal, with a lot of individuals showing flexibility between the two extremes, and the scholar Roback agreed with him. So where is this spectrum? Some things in life can be very easily categorized, like eye color, or whether someone is left-handed or right-handed, although, much like being an ambivert, there are folks who are ambidextrous and can use their right or left hands. For writing is generally what we are describing that with. If you're like me and you played baseball or softball growing up, then you may often catch with your left hand if you are right hand dominant or vice versa because of how you wear your glove and throw for softball and baseball. So that's going to be a little bit different. I do tend to catch with my left hand if someone just suddenly throws something at me. It's a reflex from all those years of playing ball, even though I am predominantly right-handed. So introversion versus extroversion really just helps us classify something in terms of its position within a spectrum so that we can understand the world around us. Remember, in previous podcasts, we've talked about the concept of binary opposites from Claude Lévi-Strauss and how binary opposites are good to think with because it makes things easier for us to understand. You cannot understand a concept like warm or cool or tepid without understanding the binary opposites of hot and cold. And similarly, one cannot understand the concept of ambivert without the binary opposites of introvert and extrovert along this spectrum. So really, it's just something to help humans understand the world around us. In this case, An individual's tendency to respond to stimuli in a certain fashion is really what places us somewhere on this introvert-extrovert spectrum. Now, the bell curve of normal distribution for continuous traits, so ones that are on a spectrum, is if we place absolute extroversion at one end of the spectrum and absolute introversion at the other, now we have a spectrum where we can account for introverts, extroverts, and every type of ambivert in between. So when we're thinking about these types of traits, it's important to remember that dichotomies, like binary opposites, is purely human, and it just gives us that framework. So don't fret if you are very clearly an ambivert or you are very extroverted versus very introverted and are having trouble expressing yourself with this scale. That's what we're going to focus on today to help you understand yourself and your needs better, as well as those of the folks around you. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk more about these differences. If you're anything like me, you have no idea how to come up with a quality logo or creative design that truly represents your creative baby. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd is a website with more than 750,000 designers distributed all over the globe who are ready to help you create your perfect custom design. To get started, you just go to designcrowd.com, post a brief describing the design you need, and Design Crowd will invite their 750,000 designers to submit designs for you to review. Within hours, you'll receive your first design, and over the course of 2 days to a week, a typical project can receive more than 100 different designs from designers all over the world. Then, you just pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. Design Crowd takes a lot of the fretting and guesswork out of selecting a freelance designer. You only have to pay for the design that you like, and if you don't like the design on the very first go around, you just go ahead and post some feedback, and the designers will tweak it based on your feedback. From logo design to WordPress design to banner ads or even tattoos, you can crowdsource just about any creative project on Design Crowd. Right now, for a special $150 VIP offer for our listeners, go to designcrowd.com/health and wellness to learn more and save up to $150 when you start any project. That's DESIGNCROWD.com/health and wellness with no spaces, or simply enter the discount code health and wellness when posting a project on Design Crowd. Get your perfect design today.
Are you looking to learn more about the latest trends from the fitness world? Are you confused by all of the different trends that are out there? The GSMC Fitness Podcast is the place for you. The GSMC Fitness Podcast is the place to come for people of all skill and interest levels. Join us as we explore the latest trends in the fitness world. Does that new exercise really work? Should I try yoga? Whatever your question, chances are good you'll find an answer on the GSMC Fitness Podcast.
Before the break, we were discussing introversion versus extroversion on the spectrum with ambiverts in between. Now we're going to discuss this just a little bit more to make sure we all have a good understanding of what these terms truly mean. It is easy for a lot of folks to identify others as an introvert or an extrovert or an ambivert based on our perceptions. But remember that we judge ourselves by our intentions and others by our perceptions. So a lot of times, if I get uncomfortable, I will do what I call hitting the extrovert button, and it's mostly a panic feature of being an introvert, where I just panic and then act very extroverted. and it's usually coming from a place of discomfort. So some folks will hang out with me and they're like, wow, you're really outgoing. And internally I'm like, I don't know where you're getting that from, but it's because I'm uncomfortable or I'm nervous. So I've hit the extrovert button. And then folks will think that I'm an extrovert. And it can be really easy for people to get those types of impressions that we don't agree with because of the differences between intention versus perception and just how we are within different contexts. Being a person and having human behavior is very multifaceted, and there are a lot of underlying contributors that make assessing where you stand on the introvert-extrovert scale to be very difficult. Your human brain is one of the most complex structures in the known universe. You have over 100 billion neurons, and the neurochemical levels in your brain are always fluctuating, and that is in combination with inherited and learned components of your behavior, and also dynamic stimuli as we move through life, the different things that we encounter in our environment. So it's both nature and nurture that form our characteristics. So it's a lot more complex than just considering it a binary or a ternary, which means 3 different subjects, like intro, extro, and ambivert distinctions. So we're a lot more complex than you may initially be led to believe by our discussion in the first segment of this scale. So a psychologist at Northwestern University, Dr. McAdams, described extroversion-introversion as a continuous dimension, and he suggested in 2017 that there are no pure types of it in psychology. He likens it to other continuous scales like height and weight, where there are folks who tend to score at the extreme ends of it, like people who are very skinny or very obese, or folks who are very tall, or like me who are quite short, or folks who score very high on traits of extroversion or introversion. But most people fall in the middle of the bell-curved shapes. So if you've heard of the bell curve before, that refers to the normal distribution of scores related to anything. So a normal distribution is shaped like a bell, and that just means that the closer you get to the middle of that spectrum, the more folks tend to fall into the very middle of it. They just tend to be normal there. It's average. It's called a normal distribution. I hope that makes sense. It's like how you have folks in a class, right? And you have people who score A's, B's, C's, D's, and F's. I will never understand why we don't put E's on our tests, but I digress. So you have these 5 scores, right? And you've heard that C is average. And if you put it on the bell curve, you will see that that is what tends to happen. B is above average, and A is very above average. D is below average, and F is very below average or failing for that specific test or whatever you're looking at for those scores. So C is average, so it's going to be at the top of that bell shape. And as you get further out from the midline, you're going to see the bell curve down until it is like negligible. It's not far above the line that the bell sits on. And so most folks are going to be getting C's. And then a lot of folks, but not most, are going to be getting B's and D's. And then rarer folks are going to be getting the F's and the A's. If you think about that in your classes that you've been through, that may make a little bit more sense. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about these normal distributions and the bell curve shape. So when you have these binary or ternary distinctions, that is just a really broad way to categorize people so that we can understand it. There are folks who complete personality assessments like the Myers-Briggs Personality Inventory that measures a component of extroversion. The Myers-Briggs test is not just about introversion versus extroversion, but you may receive a really high score for extroversion, while others are only mildly extroverted or very introverted. So is it fair to say that someone who scores, just to the left of the ambivert portion, that middle part of your bell curve towards extroversion, is very extroverted. Are they both extroverts? Both this person who is scored just slightly to the left and the person who scores way over the left and is very extroverted? That's a great question that psychologists seek to understand. So if we view the introversion-extroversion as a dichotomous personality dimension, then it is yes. If we view it as more of a spectrum, that's where it gets murky. But that's what binary opposites are meant to do, is to help us understand these binary mediators like ambiverts and the folks who are in the middle of that bell curve instead of just at the extremes where the A's and F's are, or in this case, the introverts and the extroverts. So when we think of introverts, we think of them as being reflective, private, thoughtful individuals, and extroverts are thought to be gregarious and assertive and adaptive and just overall very expressive of their emotions and very happy individuals who tend to take more risks. But it's much more complex than that. You can fall at the extreme of each dimension. I know plenty of folks in my life who present as very clear extroverts. They seem to be happy all the time, they're very go with the flow, and they are prone to taking a lot of risks. However, I also know people who are only mildly extroverted, where they definitely get more energy from going out, but they only need to go out, 3 times a week instead of every night. Stuff like that. It's very complex. So individuals can fall at the extremes of each dimension, but it's more common for them to lie somewhere between the two. So, for introverts, the main characteristics are that you recharge by spending time alone, you reflect a lot before making decisions, you tend to listen more, you enjoy one-on-one conversations a lot, you are more introspective, self-aware, you tend to think a lot before acting, you learn a lot through observation, and you get more sociable with people the better you get to know them. So if that feels right for you, then you may well be more introverted than you are extroverted, like I am. I can come off as very quiet when I first meet people or when I'm in a new setting because I'm observing everything. I like to think a lot before acting, and I don't open up very easily at first. There are things that I find to be very private that may be weird for other people to think that someone would want to keep that private, and I may share things that I think that could be shared and aren't really that private for me, but other people are like, oh wow, that's not something that I would normally think of to be in a regular discussion. And that is just a factor, in my opinion, of introverts being self-aware and introspective. So the values that we express are a little bit different in a lot of ways. But that's also just true for all types of humans. We all have our different beliefs as to what is private versus what is public knowledge. So for extroverts, you tend to recharge by socializing. Extroverts tend to make decisions more quickly. They tend to speak more. They tend to be more outgoing, perhaps easily distracted. They're very action-oriented, also very gregarious and expressive, excellent communicators, and they can enjoy being the center of attention. Now, those are characteristics that are closer to the extremes, but you will see them on the spectrum in shades of gray, more or less. So we're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to look at some of these personality differences. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Before the break, we were discussing differences between introverts and extroverts and how those are shaped by both nature and nurture, as well as how the bell curve works and where we can place introverts and extroverts within the bell curve to really understand this a lot better. So we've gone over some of the general traits of introverts and extroverts, and there are a lot of extremes in this range, but there's also a lot of gray area. A lot of these factors in introversion versus extroversion comes down to sociability. So in social situations, extroverts and introverts act very differently. Extroverts tend to show a preference for seeking out and engaging in social interactions, whereas introverts may be more reserved or reticent, and they might prefer to avoid social situations altogether. Guilford and Guilford propose some extremes of sociability, like social withdrawal and social dependence. So introverts tend to be quieter, and we tend to enjoy a lot of our alone time. We get more enjoyment from our alone time than people who are more extroverted tend to. Extroverts tend to be more socially present, and they may even thrive on the energy of the folks they're spending time with, and may often find themselves the center of attention in large social groups. So that doesn't mean that introverts are antisocial or that they don't like other people. It's just that being around other people requires an energy expenditure, and it may be a little bit overwhelming for us when compared to extroverts. Some scientists postulated that the cause of an extrovert having such a strong social presence is their tendency to talk more often and also to speak in louder volumes. So they may take up more physical space as well by talking with their hands and having broader gestures and initiating more conversations. I am glad to talk to folks in social situations if they approach me, but I don't tend to approach others. You can work with your extrovert friends and vice versa, though, to help you out with these social interactions. So, for instance, I am, as we've said, very introverted. Sometimes I consider myself to be an extreme introvert. And my buddy Matt is very much an extrovert. He is louder, he has a big presence, and is just very much... He's an embodiment of an extrovert, really. He's always happy and laughing, and his laughter is really loud, whereas I'm more prone to chuckling. But when we go to conferences together, that really works well for us because we unite our strengths. So Matt has no problem walking up to strangers and introducing himself. So he will walk up to someone that I need to meet, and he will introduce me to that person and give me an opening where I'm uncomfortable initiating that contact. On the other hand, I tend to be very observant, and so I have a lot of knowledge about these folks that people would not perhaps normally have if you are more prone to talking than listening. I am ever vigilant and observant. So in that way, when we go and talk to these people, I can talk to someone who I'm not nervous about meeting because that's not the person that I'm interested in meeting. They don't have the same research goals as me. So I can take Matt over to someone and go, "Hey, my name's Alex. I went to this school. That was your alma mater, right?" And then I can start this personal engagement with these folks, and instead of like just a blind opener like Matt is more comfortable with, and get Matt worked into the conversation that way as well. And in that way, cultivate a rapport first and then move forward, because that's how I'm most comfortable doing it. So in that way, you can really have introverts and extroverts working very well together. It's just a matter of utilizing your strengths. You can be really great friends with extroverts as well, even if you're very introverted. I love spending one-on-one time with Matt. It's a lot of fun, or in small groups. It's always boisterous, but I love a little bit of boisterous in small doses. So he is one of my really good friends for going and hanging out, and even more hanging out one-on-one or in these small groups. It's a lot of fun, and extroverts can tend to be really attentive to the folks around them and very much in the moment. So if you are the partner of an extrovert, that can be frustrating sometimes because they may not text you back for a while because they are very much present in the moment with the people they're currently hanging out with. But that also means that when you have their attention, you have their full attention. And that is something that I really enjoy about extroverts in general, even as an introvert. Whereas when you're with a fellow introvert, they may be in their head a lot as well. And it just depends on where you're at in your personal journey and where you are on your introvert-extrovert scale as to how much you may enjoy these things. Extroverts also tend to be a lot more confident and accurate when they interpret the meaning of nonverbal communication than introverts. So it's called the Extrovert Advantage, and that nonverbal decoding has been attributed to extroverts having more experience in social settings and having a greater desire for sensory stimulation. I found that to be very true in my own life. As an introvert, I am very challenged in trying to understand nonverbal communication. I don't interact with a lot of folks in many ways like that. Even when I was a manager, I was more interested in interacting via email and just getting it bluntly across what I needed to get done. It was not something that I enjoyed doing when I had to do performance reviews, for the most part. They weren't terrible, but I had to do a lot of them. I had to do like 40 of them each month because of the company structure, and that was a lot. For me as an introvert, and also meetings and everything else. So in that regard, I've not had a lot of social interaction in large groups, particularly from working from home for so long. And if you guys haven't been able to tell yet, I was homeschooled for 6 years. So a lot of the social development that tends to happen during your teenage years, I really missed out on because I was homeschooled starting at age 12 through 18. And I started community college when I was 17. So I had a lot of trouble interacting with other people who were not my core family unit or people I was already friends with at that point. Just because I didn't see a lot of people day to day. And that made it really difficult for me as an introvert as well, going along through life. So when I am hanging out with extroverts, I tend to feel kind of confused about what's going on. They tend to always seem to know exactly what is happening and what other folks tend to mean by things that are unsaid. Whereas for me, I overthink things a lot because as an introvert, I am always thinking. And I also just don't understand it because I don't have an experience base to draw from. And a lot of social communication is experiential learning. So it leaves me kind of feeling like I'm in the dark a lot and I just have no idea what's happening. That also tends to make me more blunt as a person, not because it's just a preference, but also because for many introverts, it's almost a necessity because we have trouble telling the difference between what someone really means and what they're saying if they don't just come out and say it. And that can often make introverts come off as somewhat robotic, which if you have taken the Myers-Briggs test and have found yourself to be an INTJ, like I have, then that is a very big component of who you are as a person, and it's a huge stereotype for INTJs. But a lot of it is just how much of an introvert we are and how much we put into judgment versus perception. And judgment doesn't mean judging other people in that regard. It means how we make decisions. So if we just are more passive about making decisions versus more active. So I am an introvert, but I am a very active decision maker. So I think about it a lot, but once I've made the decision, it is a final decision, and I am unwavering typically. That doesn't mean I won't give folks second chances, but it does mean that when it comes to deciding, hey, I'm going to move, or I'm going to get a new job, or make a career shift, I'm not really going to waver on that because I've considered all the variables. Which also makes you sound like a computer or a robot at that point. So that's one of the big differences for me socially that I have found to be very true in my life between introverts and extroverts. And Ackert and Panter have studied that and released their data from that in 1988. And that is what we refer to as the Extrovert Advantage, where extroverts are just better at nonverbal decoding. In addition, extroverts tend to have some forms of decision-making that are very different from introverts. Introverts are more likely to use early information to form judgments and make decisions than extroverts within the same context. Research that has been performed regarding the impact of your level of introversion to extroversion on decision-making suggests that extroverts tend to make more snap decisions based on what feels natural at the moment. A lot of extroverts are more likely to exhibit quality checking behavior before making decisions, and they also need someone to steer them in the right direction sometimes when they're faced with very important decisions. Introverts, on the other hand, tend to avoid impulsive decision-making. They prefer thoughtful consideration first, listen to their intuition, and mostly count on themselves. In the workplace, extroverts tend to hold more positive evaluations of life and also in their careers. Research has shown a lot of positive associations between folks who are more extroverted and how happy they are in their careers. Extroverts are also more likely to take action to fix unsatisfactory workplace situations than a lot of their introvert fellows. Noise distractions in the workplace tend to bother introverts more than extroverts. And some studies have found that the introduction of noise distraction can cause a lot of concentration problems for introverts, while extroverts tend to actively select higher volumes of noise. These results really support the hypothesis that introverts are more sensitive to noise reactions and they have a more heightened arousal to noises and different types of sensory information that interferes with their performance on tasks that are more complex. We're going to go on another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about whether there's a difference in introvert versus extrovert brains. As an introvert, I have a lot of ideas and a lot of irons in the fire on any given day. However, all of the thinking in the world is not going to help me create my own logo. That comes from a source of creativity that is not necessarily driven by overthinking. So if you're like me, you may have trouble coming up with a great logo or creative design to go along with all of your entrepreneurial ideas. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd is a website that helps entrepreneurs, startups, and small businesses to outsource or crowdsource custom logos, business cards, or web designs from designers all around the world. They have over 750,000 designers from Sydney, Australia to San Francisco in the United States to help you with these awesome creative ideas. They can help you make sure you get the perfect custom design every time and take a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing. So for a special $150 VIP offer for our listeners, check out designcrowd.com. designcriowd.com/health and wellness to learn more and save up to $150 when you start any project. That's designcriowd.com/health and wellness, or simply enter the discount code health and wellness when you post a project on Design Crowd today.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Break, we were talking about how introverts and extroverts approach sociability, communication, decision-making, and workplace interactions. Now we are going to talk about whether there is a difference in the brain. So they've performed a lot of research over the years in regards to extroversion and introversion, but a lot of that was largely anecdotal. As is the case for a lot of psychological studies, a lot of it is also self-reported. However, over the years, we've developed a lot of neuroimaging technologies, and that has allowed us to access a whole world of scientifically supported quantitative evidence that does suggest that the brains of folks who are introverts versus extroverts really are different. In 1997, research by Fisher, Wick, and Frederickson examined the neural differences in the introvert-extrovert spectrum by looking at regional blood flow in the cerebrum. That's the large part of the brain that we mostly think of when we think of the brain. So the part that is split down the middle with the two hemispheres and makes up most of your brain. So they did this study and they found that there is a lot of differences in dopamine receptors. In introverts, there was activity in the putamen, and it was more on the left-hand side of the brain, and these areas tended to have high concentrations of dopamine terminals. Also, introverts were displaying an increase in neuron activity within certain brain regions that tend to be associated with learning, motor control, and also vigilance. That tends to align well with what we have seen regarding introverts being more prone to long bouts of thinking and also for being very observant. Lei, Yang, and Wu in 2015 also looked at neuroimaging techniques, such as a functional MRI, to investigate these personality traits from a neurobiological perspective. They found that extroversion was associated with activations in the regions of the brain that are associated with decision-making and socially driven interactions, as well as executive function like working memory and cognition, and semantic memory and language, as well as processing emotions. So MRIs have been able to examine a lot of automatic brain reactivity as a function of extroversion. Some studies have suggested that several differences in the baseline activity of different parts of the brain indicate that extroverts have a lower baseline level of cortical arousal than introverts. Cortical arousal is associated with wakefulness. So how sleepy you are, how easy it is for you to go to sleep and wake up. Your motivation, your attention, and also how alert you are. So from that perspective, they also think that extroverts are minimally aroused in the cortical aspect and will search for additional external stimuli to raise their cortical arousal level. The MRI results also found that introverts tended to have higher responsiveness within the areas of the brain that are responsible for mediating motor, cognitive, and behavioral functions when they were presented with happy, sad, and neutral facial expressions. I think that that is very interesting because it means that the presence of arousing stimuli like people expressing their emotions may underpin the introvert's preference for avoiding social interactions. So if you feel uncomfortable sometimes with dealing with people's emotions and you're not quite sure how to deal with that, and you also feel introverted, that may be an aspect of your brain. The investigations that have been made into cerebral blood flow in regards to introversion versus extroversion have also tried to find areas of the brain that are more associated with each component of this spectrum. So they've suggested that extroversion tends to be more associated with emotion and behavior regulation and the sensory input, as well as the regulation of sleep and wakefulness. Introverts, on the other hand, are more associated with having increased blood flow in the parts of the brain that control initiation or impulse control, social behaviors, as well as sensory signals. In some cases, that means that the posterior component of some portions of the brain, like the thalamus, that regulates sleep and wakefulness, get more blood flow in extroverts, whereas in introverts, the anterior portion of the thalamus gives them more blood flow to sensory signals. I think that that's really fascinating. Our brains can literally be very different from each other, including where blood goes based on these cases of introversion and extroversion, or vice versa. The ways that our brains get their blood flow may be influencing the ways that we seek out different types of socialization. Now, as early as 300 BCE, which means before the Common Era, Greek philosophers and scientists were already considering human behavior and different characteristics. By the late 1700s, Immanuel Kant, who was a scientist and a philosopher, discussed human personality in terms of 4 different types of temperaments. He termed those sanguine, which means carefree and hopeful, choleric, which is proud and hot-headed, melancholic, anxious and thoughtful, and phlegmatic, which is reasonable and persistent. So, in psychology, human personality has since become a subject of a lot of interest. That's even before Freud was looking at human behavior in relation to personality components. And we continue to study this today. So different theories of personality look at different aspects of human behavior. Looking at introversion versus extroversion is just a component of this, but it has also been a key factor in developing early theoretical framework, especially those related to Carl Jung. So the terms introversion and extroversion, as used by Jung, were used to really describe parts of human personality that are components of the collective unconscious. So Jung thought of these traits as being the major orientations of human personalities. Over the years, a lot of researchers have developed and utilized a lot of his methods of factor analysis that support Jung's initial distinction, and they've also built a lot of theories on the foundation that Jung has laid. I have discussed some of these types of thinking in a previous podcast related to the shadow and the ego, and how Robert Johnson has built on a lot of Jung's work. We will likely be discussing Robert Johnson and Carl Jung's work some more in the future. Further work that was inspired by this includes the Digman popularized 5-factor model of personality, referred to in business as being the Big Five, or also OCEAN, O-C-E-A-N, based on openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So they developed this to represent a lot of variability in individual personalities as much as possible, while also using a small set of trait dimensions. A lot of personality psychologists agree that these 5 domains really encompass the most important basic differences in individual personality traits, and that we can also conceptualize a lot of other alternative trait models in terms of this Big 5 or ocean structure. So we're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to look at some of these personality differences. Stay tuned.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. So let's break it down by the numbers. What do statistics say? Y'all know I'm a big fan of statistics. So if you were to look for statistics regarding introversion and extroversion, you'd probably find a lot of conflicting information. A lot of it depends on the source. A lot of facts and figures that are used are also unverified. Everyone likes to think of themselves as already knowing what introverts and extroverts are because we use it so colloquially. But as we found in this podcast today, there are a lot of other factors. And in the realms that they were initially conceptualized, like in psychology, they do have very specific terms, and there is such a broader understanding of the concept. There are quantifiable statistics out there, though. So let's look at some of it. The first official random sample by the Myers-Briggs organization found that introverts made up 50.7% of the United States general population and extroverts 49.3%. Within that sample, 45.9% of males and 52.5% of females were extroverted, and 54.1% of men and 47.5% of women were introverted. So that's not a super wide margin, but it is interesting nonetheless. A study by the American Trends Panel in 2014 used a 5-point scale and studied 3,243 participants who described themselves as being closer to extroversion versus introversion. On this scale, they found that 12% described themselves as very extroverted, 5% considered themselves to be very introverted. 77% of the people who responded described themselves as being somewhere between the two extremes, and the remaining 6% were unsure. A study of 3,000 American lawyers found that the majority, 56.4%, were introverts and 43.6% were extroverts. That indicated that extroversion versus introversion may be important on the area in which a lawyer practices. So, for example, labor law had the largest number of extroverts, while real estate law and tax work seemed to draw more introverts. And I think that that really makes a lot of sense. Sheridan in 1994 surveyed over 1,600 librarians using the Myers-Briggs approach, and they had hypothesized that librarians as a group would tend to be more logical problem solvers who would work out solutions quietly on their own in their heads instead of doing it loudly or collaboratively. And they found indeed that 63% of librarians were introverted and only 37% were extroverted. 50% of extroverts also tend to make snap decisions or quick decisions, according to a study by Noman in 2016, and 79% of introverts tend to rely on their intuition and their inner feelings. So it's not just thinking through things a lot, but it's also listening essentially to your gut. We've also found over the years that introverts are more likely to locate the essence of who they really are on the internet, and extroverts locate it through traditional social interactions. What we really mean is that in expressing this concept of the real me, the essence of who you are, is described as a crucial life skill, and folks who can't express the real me tend to suffer more from serious psychological disorders. A lot of studies have postulated that social services provided on the internet represent an otherwise untapped avenue for introverted personalities to form social contacts. I find that to be very true, especially the more I stream on Twitch. So I stream on Twitch under the name Sharknado Week, and I do that every day. And most of the people who come and hang out with me they're from all over the world, by the way. They're from Tunisia and Serbia and Brazil and Ireland, also from the United States, and some folks in China right now too. So it's very interesting to get to meet these folks from all over the world, but I also find that most of them tend to be introverted, and I think that is also a function of that social media platform. So on the internet and on Twitch in particular, it's primarily used as a platform for people who are into gaming. But the component that I'm in is the just chatting category, so I just go in there and I talk to folks. It's kind of a variety stream, so sometimes we play music and sing songs and stuff. Sometimes we sit there and they watch me paint while I talk to them, kind of like Bob Ross. It's very wholesome. And they chat back with me by typing into the chat box. But I find that most of them tend to be introverts, and we talk about that as well. Sometimes it's just easier for introverts to talk to people in an anonymous fashion, or not having to deal with those facial expressions face to face and worrying about schooling their own face. Typing also gives you time to think about what you're going to say before you say it, and whether you want to say it. You're not truly on a timeline at that point. And so that has been a really great source of social exchange for me and also for a lot of other folks who are introverted on the internet. A lot of people who are heavy social media users, and that means more than 2 hours per day, are seen by themselves and others as being more outgoing and extroverted, according to a 2010 study by Harbaugh, which I think is very interesting. I would be interested in reading more of that study and seeing which types of social media, perhaps, that these folks are using. I consider myself to be very introverted, but I do spend a lot of time on Twitch as a social media form, and I also tend to spend more time on Facebook Messenger talking to a group chat of my friends that I'm in each day, as well as one of my extrovert friends who I do talk to each day via the internet. Introverts and extroverts respond a lot differently to different types of workplace training as well. The people who focus more on idea generation tend to be more extroverts, and the people who are more on relaxation training, like opening up your mind and removing mental barriers, tend to be more into introversion. So thinking about the different types of introverts versus extroverts on your team can be really important for maximizing effective training for your team members. That is something I practiced as a manager as well. I had my folks take the Myers-Briggs test to see where they fell in the placement. There are 16 different personality types in there, and introversion versus extroversion is the first trait that is scored. So in that manner, I was able to tell a lot about how my folks wanted to be viewed and how they wanted to be treated. A lot of psychologists aren't a big fan of the Myers-Briggs testing because folks answer it subjectively, and it's also based on whether they feel those certain traits are true for them. But a lot of folks answer it as how they would like to be or how they would like to be seen rather than as how they are. I find that in business that is still helpful in a lot of ways because it shows me how folks would like to be and how they would like to be treated, which helps me in discussions with them, guiding towards how I can best help them and help them develop certain skills. I can ask certain probing questions based off of their responses to those studies and to their score on that. So I, as an INTJ, want to just know what I'm doing right, what I'm doing wrong. If I'm doing anything wrong, how to fix it. So when I'm coaching fellow INTJs, I ask them, hey, do you want to talk about your personal life too? And if they are an INTJ, 9 times out of 10, they're going to tell you no. They just want to know the business aspect so they can get back to doing their work and then they can go home. Because INTJs tend to compartmentalize their work and everything. They're very work-oriented, business-focused. So my other folks who may be like ESFPs are much more extroverted and they are very chatty. So I'm like, you want to talk about your personal life? And they're like, yeah, I'm going on vacation soon and this is what I'm going to be doing and all this other stuff. And so I still give everyone the openings to talk about these things if they want, but it helps me overall guide myself towards helping these folks feel valued as employees in the best way possible. For folks like my ESFPs, that tends to be more taking an interest in who they are as people. And for my INTJs in particular, that tends to be more of making sure that they get a lot of praise associated with their work and making sure that it is specific, genuine, and accurate praise. And if things are going wrong, they are also very receptive to hearing that. They just want to know how to fix it. So in my experience, that works really well in business. Psychology aside, the psychologists can debate it in their own platform. But if you work with other folks, I tend to find that it's helpful. All right, we're going to go on a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to discuss introversion versus extroversion some more.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Before the break, we were talking about some statistics related to introverts versus extroverts, as well as the big 5 and how these things really operate in a business sense. Now we're going to talk a little bit about emotional wellness and how being an introvert versus an extrovert really factors into that. So mental health issues may vary among introverts versus extroverts. If you are somewhere in between, that is okay too. As we have found today, 77% of folks surveyed tend to think that they're somewhere in the middle, and a lot of folks do follow that pattern in psychological studies, as we discussed regarding the bell curve. So, you may be anywhere on that spectrum, and wherever you are, that's okay. It's just important to gauge how energized you are when surrounded by others versus having your alone time. Whichever type you tend to trend more towards, there are just certain things to be mindful of in regards to your mental health. A lot of times, folks tend to dismiss introverts for being shy or timid, but don't be ashamed of being an introvert. It's okay. Being comfortable with yourself and enjoying being alone can also be viewed as a strength, and I very much think it is a strength of mine. It is something that is very helpful for me right now, especially during this era of practicing social distancing due to the coronavirus pandemic. So excessive isolation can be very unhealthy though, and as introverts, even though we enjoy our alone time, it's important for us to be mindful of how much time we are getting with other people. That is going to help us avoid depression and other mental health issues. It's also important for us to go outside. Since we enjoy being alone so much, it can be really easy for us to just stay indoors. But getting outside and getting vitamin D is super important for us because remember, 90% of vitamin D is made in the body using energy from the sun, and only 10% comes from our diets. So, sometimes we do still need to get out. You think of it as being for your physical health, even if you think that your mental health is still totally fine without it. However, you also don't have to leave your home to be getting these social interactions. I am often considering myself as the one-on-one friend. My friends also consider me to be the crisis friend. When something goes sideways, call Alex, and I will be there to help you figure out whatever the crisis is with a calm, level head. That is one of my strengths as an introvert, and even my extrovert friends will reach out to me for that in the chaotic times. So you can think about being an introvert as being a good thing too. There is no inherent good or bad anywhere along the spectrum. It's just a matter of being mindful of the things that we're good at and also the spaces where we could use a little bit of work. So part of our inner work that we've discussed previously by Robert Johnson and Carl Jung is going to involve being mindful of how much time we're getting with other people. It can also be a matter right now during coronavirus of using our strengths to help our introvert friends. They're probably struggling quite a bit right now and feeling cabin fever. So in that regard, reach out to your extrovert friends over the internet. So you can FaceTime them because they may need face-to-face interaction. You can also reach out via Messenger or text. You can give them a call. I know millennials, we are allergic to phone calls, but, text them first, ask them if they would like a call, and then perhaps they will take you up on it. A healthy person, though, is going to be usually somewhere in the middle as an ambivert. So you enjoy people's company, but you also are good with being alone. That is what a lot of these studies say, but I think that really healthy in this context is just depending on how mindful you are of your surroundings and are you getting enough social interaction for your personal needs. Because I think everyone needs at least a little bit. If you're starting to get really grumpy, then you may be needing to get some more sunlight or get you some more fiber to help the serotonin in your gut flourish, and also to make sure that you are seeing folks a little bit or talking to them a little bit. A lot of studies, as we discussed in our episode on loneliness, have found that talking to people online or via social media can be just as helpful for addressing subjective loneliness as in-person contact for a lot of people. Introverts can, be excessively isolated. I know that personally I am guilty of that. All of my hobbies, my volunteer work, and my actual work are work at home, so I can go many days without leaving my home. That is something that is partly, I think, due to being an introvert and also partly due to being homeschooled during those socially formative years. So that nature versus nurture dichotomy that has really influenced my personal traits and my propensity towards introversion. And that's okay. But it's also important for me to go, okay, I need to go outside. So I did a Twitch stream the other day outside. I went for a walk in the local park. I still practice social distancing. I stayed at least 6 feet away from other people, and most folks weren't out there on the trail. Now, we were also making sure that we were getting some fresh air. Getting some fresh air and sunlight can be really important for helping you to stay healthy as well. So, we're not in large groups when we're out hiking, so you are still practicing social distancing. That's just something to keep in mind. You're really trying to avoid large groups of people that are heavily concentrated and that are in close proximity to one another. It's okay to still go out and get some air and some exercise. Now, with being in isolation, that's not the only reason that introverts have found to perhaps be more susceptible to mental health issues like depression. They've also performed some neurological studies over the years and found that the brain activity in introverts tends to be a lot more active than in extroverts, as we discussed earlier. So it makes sense that introverts don't really crave or even require a lot of additional stimuli, because we already have a lot of inner thoughts going on. Our brains are just already turning over, and we're pretty stimulated in that way. We are internally stimulated rather than externally stimulated. So brain activity like that can be a strength, and introverts are frequently thought of as being great thinkers and being very creative, but it can also mean that we can be over analytic and we can overthink our emotions and our feelings. So we can get caught up in these feedback loops of overthinking and overfeeling, particularly if we are in social seclusion. So bottling up negative emotions like that can also trigger feelings of shame or guilt or worthlessness, or you might feel hopelessness, and can cause you to be more prone to having mental health issues. You also may be more prone to be a perfectionist if you are an introvert, and that means that you may also be very self-critical. If you're anything like me, then that may ring especially true for you. So introverts may have to practice a lot more self-love and self-care in those particular ways, where we are having to consciously think about the things that we are grateful for and that we're happy with, and kind of considering the concept of good enough. For me, that means practicing abstract art. I cannot get anything perfect with abstract art because there is no perfection necessarily to strive for, in my experience. Now, I use it as catharsis, and keep in mind, I'm not trained as an artist. So if you're trained as an artist and you understand the elements of abstract painting much better than I do, then that may be different for you. But for me, I practice art because it is something that I don't have to be good or bad at. I think a lot of times, especially in the Western world, we tend to think that the only things worth doing are the things that can be monetized. And in that way, that is not particularly helpful because it also tends to make you more prone to perfectionism, I think, because you're wanting to maximize the worth of these items. That's something that I have to fight in myself, is my tendency to strive towards perfectionism, because a lot of times I also feel that if I can't do it perfectly, I don't want to do it. I would rather make something perfect than do something halfway. However, one thing that has helped me a lot is a quote by one of my favorite authors, Kurt Vonnegut Jr., and he says, "To practice any art, no matter how well or badly, is a way to make your soul grow, so do it." He goes so far as to say that you should make a face in your mashed potatoes, or pretend that you're Count Dracula, dance home after school, and sing in the shower. It doesn't matter what the art is. Just practicing it can help your soul grow. It can help you experience becoming and to find out what is inside of you. And as an introvert, that is something I have truly struggled with, but his advice has really helped me out a lot. So I practice that with my abstract art and with my music, and playing music and going, you know what? It's okay that the music doesn't sound the same way that it sounds on the radio. Stevie Nicks says it's only right that you play the way you feel it, but listen carefully to the sound. And that has also really stuck with me. And I found that when I play it the way I feel it, it makes me happier. It helps me to express sorrow and joy, and it helps a lot with catharsis. And that's something that we can learn from our extrovert friends, the friends who don't really seem to experience a lot of these tendencies towards perfectionism and being self-critical that introverts tend to. It helps reduce our stress, it reduces mental and physical exhaustion, and can really help prevent mental health issues. So take a look at your extrovert friends, you guys, and look at them as models of mental health as well. You don't have to do everything that they do, but we can learn a lot from each other, and it can help us to stay well. Extroverts can also have their own set of problems, though, and it's important to keep that in mind. If you have the need to always be around other people, then you may be having trouble being comfortable in being alone with yourself. And in that way, you may want to talk to some of your introvert friends about what you can do to make sure that you are really cultivating that inner you and finding the real you. Because if you feel that you're only you when you're with other people, there may be a component of you that you are missing. Likewise, if you're an introvert and you feel that you're only you when you're alone, there may be a component in expressing yourself to others to help you feel seen and heard and understood that your extrovert friends can help you out with, particularly as it comes to emotional processing, because extroverts tend to have more activity and blood flow in their amygdala than we do, and your amygdala is associated with your feelings. So there are a lot of things we can learn from each other, and we want to have a healthy amount of introspection without judgment for the introverts. And we also need to make sure that our extrovert friends aren't truly avoiding all of their introspection. That's not healthy, and that's a sign that someone perhaps has an issue they don't want to face. As introverts, we may be in a unique position to help our extrovert friends face those issues. Although extroverts tend to have more of a reputation for being more assertive or aggressive in a lot of ways, as introverts, it's important to assertively love our friends in some ways. We can see things that perhaps they are not normally conscious of, and vice versa. They are more aware of emotional intelligence in many ways than we are, and we can help each other out in those ways. You just have to go ahead and buck up and go, hey, I'm worried about you. You have been out every night this week, and I feel like you're not dealing with this thing that happened. Do you want to make space with me to talk about it? I'm here for you if you want to talk. You don't necessarily need to push them, but being a little bit more assertive than you may normally be comfortable with can be really important for your extrovert friends. I know that with mine, I do let them know things that are not necessarily comfortable for them, but it is honest and they do come around to it. Because a lot of times, extroverts do make their decisions from spur-of-the-moment feelings, whereas introverts tend to think about it more. And I sometimes go, no, I understand where you're going right now, but you're in a positive feedback cycle, and what's happening is not actually true. You're just in an emotional feedback cycle, and I need you to step back with me a minute so that we don't spiral any further. And for my friends, sometimes they get mad at me and then they will message me back and they'll go, I'm sorry, I freaked out. And that's after they've cooled down, of course. So it might take a couple hours, it might take a day or two, but that's okay. And ultimately, they end up feeling a lot better for it in the long run. I think it's important for us as introverts to harness some of that assertiveness that we see modeled in our extrovert friends so that we can help our extrovert friends to cultivate some more of the introversion and introspection that we really carry as introverts to help people be comfortable in their own skin and in their own mind, and they can help us be comfortable in social situations. I think a really great example of seeing some of that is in the new Netflix show, I'm Not Okay With This. I watched it this last week, and I very much enjoyed it. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. Netflix isn't paying me to say that or anything. I just thought it was a very great dichotomy between Sid and Dina and how they are introvert and an extrovert, and they are exploring who they are as people, both separately and together, and kind of helping each other out in the ways that they are best able to. I hope that this has really helped you guys understand the differences between introversion, extroversion, and ambiversion, and making sure that we are checking on each other as we go throughout our lives, but also particularly in this time of social distancing, as it may be more comfortable or more frustrating for each of us, depending where we are on the vast introversion-extroversion spectrum. Remember, most folks tend to be somewhere in between in that bell curve, but they may be more to one side or more to the other. Check on each other, regardless of whether you're introverts versus extroverts, and make sure that you are reaching out via social media to help spread your strengths with each other as well. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Health and Wellness Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Health and Wellness Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.